Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gina Livermore, and I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on service innovations that were implemented by the VR agencies in Kentucky and Minnesota under the Substantial Gainful Activity, or SGA Project demonstration. The webinar is sponsored by Mathematica Center for Studying Disability Policy. The center was established in 2007 to help build the evidence base for effective disability policy research. Findings from our center's research can help inform disability policies and programs across the nation to better meet the needs of Americans with disabilities. One way we try to do this is through our disability policy forums and webinars. The demonstration you'll hear about today was funded by a grant from the Rehabilitation Services Administration awarded back in 2010. The goal of the grant was to develop and test VR service innovations designed to improve the employment outcomes of VR clients who were receiving Social Security disability insurance benefits. So you might ask, why the focus on SSDI clients? Well, at the time the grant was released, the SSDI program was experiencing tremendous growth, and the SSDI Trust Fund had begun operating on deficit. Around that same time, the Government Accountability Office released reports criticizing the federal state VR program for not helping Social Security beneficiaries obtain jobs with earnings high enough to leave the disability rolls. The focus of the demonstration on SSDI beneficiaries was in response to these factors, but also because SSDI beneficiaries were a logical group to target for VR service innovations. Most have significant work experience and skills that might be quickly leveraged by VR agencies to help them return to work. The demonstration became known as the SGA Project because the goal was to find ways to help SSDI beneficiaries receiving VR services obtain employment with earnings high enough to potentially leave the rolls, so technically higher than the Social Security defined SGA level, but also high enough to achieve a better quality of life than they would experience on benefits. In other words, help them engage in substantial gainful activity in the broader sense of the term. Today we will hear from a panel of experts from Mathematica and the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The panel will describe the experiences of the VR agencies in Kentucky and Minnesota in implementing the SGA Project innovations and the impact of the innovations on SSDI client outcomes. Susan Foley, a senior research fellow at the Institute for Community Inclusion, will start us off with a discussion of the motivation behind the SGA Project innovations. Then Joe Maroney, a senior program manager for public policy at the Institute for Community Inclusion, will describe the specific interventions that were implemented in Kentucky and Minnesota. After that, Purvi Sevak, a senior researcher at Mathematica, will describe the key findings on the impacts of the SGA Project innovations. Todd Honeycutt, a senior researcher at Mathematica, will follow Purvi with a presentation on implementation challenges, lessons learned, and implications for program design and future study. Finally, we're fortunate to have Steve Witterson, the CEO of the Council of State Administrators for Vocational Rehabilitation, here to discuss the implications of the research from the VR program administrator perspective. Before we start the presentations, our webinar coordinator, Brian Willis, has a few housekeeping reminders for the audience. Brian?
Thank you, Gina. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. If you have questions for presenters during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will address as many questions as possible during the session, but if a fuller detailed answer is required or we run out of time, we will answer your question later via email. We do capture all questions. If you have technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. However, you can also submit your technical questions through the Q&A widget. A copy of today's slide deck and other resources are available in the Resource List widget, indicated by the green file icon at the bottom of your screen. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link used to access today's event. Now back to you, Gina.
Thanks, Brian. After Steve Witterson speaks, we'll break for questions from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel on your screen at any time during the forum. Now let me turn it over to Susan Foley.
Thank you, Gina, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm Susan Foley, a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Community Inclusion at UMass Boston, and we were the awardee of the RSA model demonstration. And I just want to give a shout out to the project officers that were very supportive of us, Robert Gronendale and Jerry Elliott, as well as the two states, Kentucky and Minnesota, for taking this journey with us. When we first got the grant, the idea was that to find or identify a employment services package fully under the control of VR agencies that would target wage outcomes of SSDI-only non-blind customers of VR. So RSA was looking for an employment services model demonstration in which VR could implement to see if it could improve wage outcomes. So our first task was trying to figure out, well, what would that intervention be? And as we had three questions we were trying to figure out, we embarked upon a series of activities in the first 2 years of the project to come up with that intervention or to design it. The first question, we tried to figure out if there was a particular promising practice already out there that maybe we could take a look at, or should we find a practice happening in one high-performing state VR agency, define it, extract it, export it to others, or should we get a sense of what is happening and design something back at the laboratory, so to speak, particularly design it from states that may have high-performing outcomes in this area. So as we put the clues together, we interviewed state VR directors, I think about 20, 30 of them. RSA 911 trend analysis, we conducted some analysis of data over time, over a 5-year period of time, to see which VR agencies might be progressing on wage outcomes. We conducted case studies of 8 state VR agencies that had something going on. I think those were things that we had a very broad net about that might have something to do with SSDI-only customers, and then an expert panel. In our interview responses, we found that very few states mentioned specific efforts for SSDI-only customers. Oklahoma had an effort with Hertz. Alabama was doing very interesting things with performance evaluations and the way they did benefits counseling. Nebraska also had a great relationship with Easter Seals. Most listed services available to any and all VR clients, and thought that the high performers at least thought that the reason they had high performing outcomes was that they might have high performing outcomes in general. So we concluded that most VR agencies were not offering a specific employment package per se for SSDI only beneficiaries. So some of our preliminary analysis with RSA 911 found some interesting relationships and correlations that really didn't necessarily create a model for us, but gave us a few clues. They have fewer counseling staff and more counseling support staff as a percentage of all staff, fewer customers on wait lists, provided more services to customers through VR personnel and purchased fewer average days to IPE or individual plan for employment, fewer SSDI-only customers closed because of refused services, and a lower average cost to purchase services. And taking that together, we wondered if maybe pacing of services and team approaches might be something we might want to consider. And it seemed to be true when we looked at our case study findings that multiple VR agencies were emphasizing early and progressively detailed access to financial services, not just benefits counseling, but a broader understanding of financial services. Rehab counseling strategies with a sense of urgency and rapid engagement, a customer service approach, a business relations focus to job development rather than just job placement, and active attempts to align office-level procedures and policies for responsive client services. So what we came to is an early and rapid coordinated team approach and would improve engagement, employment, wage outcomes of SSDI-only non-blind customers of VR at closure from VR. And you'll hear more about the details of that from Joe. If the question remained, if we build office-level capacity to implement an early and rapid coordinated team approach, will those offices get better employment outcomes for SSDI beneficiaries? So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Joe Maroney to talk more specifically about the state.
Thanks, Susan. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for participating. As Susan said, I'll tell you a little bit more about the actual implementation of the project in Kentucky and Minnesota, and also a little bit about some of the context, the successes, the challenges, some of the sustainability issues what we took from it. A lot of the specific state content around challenges, successes, sustainability is taken right from what the states have told us, not our own analysis. But I'll throw in a few things towards the end about what we see as some general learnings from it. So Susan mentioned the basic model of the design of the SGA model. The specific model was essentially the same in both states. There was some variation, which I'll mention, but Susan mentioned the importance of pacing, we felt, so we created this model talking about trying to do eligibility determination within 3 days, have the first team meeting, which we talked about, which involved the job placement person, the financial educator, and the counselor within 7 days, and trying to get the plan completed within 30 days of application. We really wanted to focus on weekly, regular contact, whether in person or on the phone or by email or text message. Really emphasize presumptive eligibility, which leads to pacing, which if you're on Social Security, should be very easy for VOC Rehab to determine eligibility fairly quickly. We saw the plan of service, the individual plan for employment, as a living document that can be and should be amended as clients progress. And we really wanted to encourage people to rely less on outside assessment for deciding level of functioning and level of disability in terms of order of selection, and really use greater reliance on counselor judgment. And we really, as you can tell from the model, really emphasized teamwork. Kentucky implemented it, and once again, I'll mention Minnesota implemented the same model with some slight variation. There was a VOC Rehab counselor, financial specialist, and a job placement specialist. In Kentucky, all the financial specialists were certified benefits counselors, which they call KWICs, and they covered multiple offices. In Minnesota, there was an emphasis more on financial education and not necessarily all certified benefits counselors, and they were essentially assigned to one office each. Kentucky, in terms of the model of technical assistance, really emphasized the VOC Rehab counselor as the team lead. And even though that was sort of the same in Minnesota, there was a slight difference in the way we approach technical assistance. And there were job placement specialists on each office team in Kentucky, meeting with the consumer prior to the plan development, as we said, to talk about labor market information and help in developing employment goals. In terms of some context for Kentucky, Kentucky had done some recent asset development initiatives. There was a concern, as there is in several states, about increasing their ability to generate Social Security reimbursements. We had worked with them in previous projects, so there was some positive feedback in terms of ICI work. In terms of the context, just to deal with, the agency director was very invested in innovation and staff development and very eager to participate, but there was some turnover, as it turned out, during the project. And there really was a desire early on to improve links with Social Security in terms of information sharing. In terms of moving on to pacing, Kentucky in particular had a very long time from application to plan development when we first got involved. And they were very interested in improving it. The Kentucky VOC Rehab counselors particularly had major concerns about using presumptive eligibility because of the issue that there had been a long lag time with Social Security verification, and we helped to mitigate this. Initially, the job placement folks were worried about that they would be involved too early and that would be inefficient. However, as things progressed, it seemed like there was much more comfort with the early involvement of job placement folks. And later on in the project, not early on, we introduced and helped them introduce motivational interviewing and the use of the online decision support tool, DB101. In terms of the TA process, we had one statewide 3-day training to roll it out. We had regular contact by ICI TA staff. We had periodic ICI TA visits, and there were lots of ICI participation in local and state level meetings, including with the state rehab counselor. What were some of the barriers initially? I think there was early weak links with local Social Security about verification. There were lots of staff changes administratively. The local work incentive, the WIPR, the official work incentive group, had issues about resource availability. There were lots of distractions in Kentucky and lots of places about WIOA implementation, budget issues. And what they identified is they should have spent more time on infrastructure, that they had a lack of infrastructure in terms of updated computer equipment, online assessments. Some of the successes they saw, in general, the staff saw value in the SGA framework. It really helped to get the early identification of Social Security recipients to enable presumptive eligibility. That really was a change from what existed. Kentucky felt there was an ability to build capacity in several areas, specifically, obviously, job placement of financial specialists. And you'll hear from some of the data, there were some preliminary indications of increased employment rate and earnings. In terms of what they saw as sustainability, the financial specialists are being retained under a contract as opposed to through staff. There's increased use of motivational interviewing and DB 101 as there was some training. And there's increased use of presumptive, which leads to much faster eligibility. When we talk about Minnesota, there was the same basic design, but there were some specific differences. As I mentioned, the financial specialists were located in each office, and they weren't directly employed by Voc Rehab, but by a group that's centralized through the State Department of Human Services that existed prior to our grant, called the Disability Linkage Line, or sometimes in a different kind of arrangements for a local independent living center. So they were there consistently, but they were not necessarily on the payroll of Voc Rehab. A full benefits analysis was always available to clients when needed, but the financial specialist was not necessarily a certified work incentive counselor, and only a full benefits analysis was made not for everyone routinely, but either upon request or some indication that one was needed. As I said, both the job placement and financial specialists were in each office, on multiple offices, and Minnesota had this pre-existing disability linkage line, which does not exist, and there's really no analog in Kentucky. Minnesota added to its benefits training with what considered locally called Forced Cornerstones Financial Education, which is essentially a statewide funded project to help provide financial education to low-income folks. And that really supplemented the benefits counseling approach. In terms of the specific Minnesota context, before we got there, and one of the reasons they were interested is there was a particular interest in increasing the speed of delivery of VR services from application to eligibility and subsequently to plan. So our focus on pacing really fit into their overall strategy. Before our involvement, they've had a years-long history of doing various levels of motivational interviewing training, from basic overviews to actually training people as motivational interviewing trainers. So that existed prior to our involvement. They had, unlike Kentucky, a very strong link with the local Social Security for benefit verification that was basically already being done in 2 or 3 days, even before we got there. As I mentioned, they had this existing state-level disability linkage line. They already had an existing emphasis on a team. They didn't quite have the same team we did, but they had an existing emphasis on team approaches. They're very high on developing innovation projects, and they have a particular person who spearheads a lot of local innovation projects at the central office. And Minnesota as a state has a very strong social safety net already. However, 2 particular issues was they have a lot of concerns in terms of Olmstead complaints. So that because they have very strong provider groups who run a lot of still fairly traditional day programs, and they have a heavy reliance on sub-minimum wage. In terms of the technical assistance process, there was roughly the same design, but there were some nuances because we had some different people doing it. Because of the size, we did 2 3-day rollout trainings, not just one. And as part of the feedback, there was a concern that maybe we didn't hone in too much on the technical issues that we should have. The financial specialists in Minnesota had a lot of in-state, in-service trainings with the disability linkage line as well as us. The job placement specialists were able to attend these quarterly technical assistance meetings, and we attended them as TA visits as well as local office visits as a TA staff from ICI. We involved the Voc Rehab counselors in on-site TA visits, but we really spent a lot more time in Minnesota with the financial specialist and the job placement specialist. And that acronym RAN there that you see received support from their RAMs. The RAM's regional area managers, they're basically office directors in Minnesota of the 17 offices we were involved with, of the 8 offices we were involved with for the intervention. And we participated as well in administrative meetings, both on-site and remotely, and provided individual TA calls in terms of the managers. In terms of sustainability, they're maintaining the financial specialists with ongoing training through the disability linkage line, and they're using their contracts with independent living centers to keep the financial specialists employed, and they eventually hope to add permanent positions as full-time staff. The 2 additional job placement people that they hired for a project were retained. The other job placement people were already existing on the Minnesota staff, so they were able to retain those. And they're very, very interested because of their prior involvement in maintaining faster pacing for the entire agency. What are some of the lessons learned? We found that people can use developmental IPEs effectively. It seems that not everyone needs a full benefits analysis. That's certainly the message from the Minnesota project. As I mentioned, when we did the rollout, particularly in Minnesota, I think we were going to do a similar design again or a similar project again. We needed to rely less on background and conceptual information and much more on some technical information. And interesting to us, or at least which came as a surprise, or to me at least, is the voc rehab counselors, particularly in Minnesota, felt they needed a lot more help on team facilitation, which we just assumed already existed as a skill set, but they felt they needed some more. And partly because of the way we did technical assistance in Minnesota, but it also came out of Kentucky a little bit less, that with this team approach, some voc rehab counselors felt that they lost control of the process more than they had in the past, and that some of the work they used to do was now being farmed out, so to speak, to financial placement specialists and the benefits financial educators. I think the other thing, and I really reinforce this, as someone who's worked in voc rehab for a lot of years, people used to be seeing the pacing of voc rehab and the time it took voc rehab to get to learn, know people and move on a plan used to be seen as a feature of the system that was immutable, so to speak. And we really try to identify slow pacing as a bug to be fixed, not a feature of the system. Obviously, as in a lot of change projects, leadership support is an important piece for any kind of quality improvement, and not just seen as an extraneous research project. And I would say one of the things to consider, because we put a fair amount of resources in and not everybody can duplicate those resources, is for voc rehab to consider a modified version of this approach with other populations. And some populations I thought might benefit would be students with mental health and behavioral health issues, TANF recipients, ex-offenders, those in recovery from substance abuse. The thing all those folks have in common is usually they need something quick because you'll lose them in engagement, and finances are an important issue. Social Security might not be an important issue, but finances are an important issue. So having said that, I appreciate your time, and let me turn it over to Purvi Sevak.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Purvi Sevak, and I'm going to be talking to you about the impacts of the SGA Project innovations. I'm going to start first by talking about the design of the demonstration and the methods we used to estimate the impacts of the innovations on client outcomes. I'll then share results from Kentucky and Minnesota on the impacts of the innovations. And I'll end discussing the potential for longer-term impacts of the innovations. We designed the demonstration in a way that would generate rigorous and objective evidence about the potential impact of the innovations. This requires delivering the innovations to some clients and comparing their outcomes to those of a group of clients that were otherwise similar to the demonstration clients but did not receive the innovations. To also make sure that the demonstration clients reflected the range of offices in the state across geography and other characteristics, we used a clustered random assignment approach. We grouped offices into strata based on their geographic location, whether they were urban or rural, and whether and based on the outcomes of their SSDI clients before the demonstration began. We selected an office from each stratum to deliver the enhanced SGA innovation services and another office from the same stratum that delivered usual VR services. At these offices, all non-blind SSDI-only VR applicants were part of the demonstration. I want to emphasize that this was the full population of SSDI, of non-blind SSDI-only VR applicants in these states over that time period. It wasn't a sample. There wasn't any volunteering. Everyone was enrolled in the demonstration. We had about 1,000 clients in each state enrolled in the demonstration, half at the enhanced service offices and half at the usual service offices. Enrollment began mid-2015 and continued for about a year. We estimated impacts of the innovations using the VR agency's data. We estimated impacts on 4 domains that the demonstration was that was designed to improve. In the domain of pace of services, we estimated impacts by looking at the share of clients that had assigned IPE within 30 days of application. We looked at the impact on engagement by looking at the share of clients that continued with VR without dropping out until the share of clients that did not drop out before obtaining competitive employment. We also looked at the share of clients that closed with competitive employment and the share that closed with earnings at or above SGA level. We had agency data through late April 2017, so about a year to 2 years after enrollment in the demonstration. We estimated the impacts as the difference in outcomes between the clients in the usual service offices and those in the enhanced service offices. We confirmed that the clients in the usual service offices were very similar to those in the enhanced service offices. The only difference was that the clients in the enhanced service offices were exposed to the enhanced services. So there were no significant differences in those 4 outcomes we looked at during the period before the demonstration, and there were no differences in client characteristics over the period of the demonstration. Nevertheless, we used regression models to control for any other client characteristics and pre-demonstration office-level differences. We also used statistical adjustments to account for the fact that we had office-level clustered randomization. I'm going to present results for Kentucky first and then for Minnesota. We found that the innovations had a significant impact on the pace and employment of clients in Kentucky. 27% of the demonstration clients had assigned IPE within 30 days at the enhanced service offices. This was significantly higher than the 10% of clients at the usual service offices that had assigned IPE within 30 days. We did not find a significant impact of the demonstration on engagement. We did find that 25% of clients closed with competitive integrated employment by April 2017, and that was statistically significantly higher than the share that closed with competitive integrated employment at the usual service offices. We also found that a significantly higher share of clients at the enhanced service offices closed with SGA level earnings or higher, 8.2%. I want to pause for a minute to let you look at these impacts because they're huge. The share of clients that had assigned IP within 30 days was more than twice as high at the enhanced demonstration offices. The share that closed with SGA level earnings or higher was more than 3 times as high in the enhanced service offices. We also found that there were some differences in the specific services delivered at the enhanced service offices. Relative to the usual service clients, enhanced service clients were more likely to receive job placement services, other employment-related services, and benefit counseling services. Not surprisingly, they also received these services sooner. 47 days sooner for job placement services, 82 days sooner for other employment-related services, and 29 days earlier for benefit counseling services. And I want to clarify that in Kentucky, this includes both staff-provided services and authorized services by other providers. Moving now to Minnesota. In Minnesota, we found that the SGA Project innovations improved pacing and engagement. 35% of clients at the enhanced service offices had assigned to IPE within 30 days. 68% remained engaged, meaning that they either closed with competitive integrated employment or they were still involved with the VR agency. 28% of clients in the enhanced offices closed with competitive integrated employment. This was just shy of the conventional standard of statistical significance in terms of the difference between the share at the enhanced service offices and the share at the usual services offices. So the P was 11%, so just shy of the 10%. We also saw some changes in service delivery in Minnesota. Relative to usual service clients, enhanced service clients were less likely to be referred to providers for job placement or benefit counseling services because they were receiving them in-house through the demonstration. And we found no difference in the referrals to providers for other employment services or training services. So you might be thinking now, well, that's great. These two agencies, they improved outcomes for only clients over this time period, but other clients that they're serving on non-SSDI only clients. And so we looked to see if there was any of that going on, and we could find no evidence that there were any impacts on non-demonstration clients in these states. I want to close by talking about the fact that the longer-term impacts of the innovations are still unknown. At the time that we received the data from Kentucky and Minnesota, about 35 to 40% of the cases were still open in each state, and the estimated impacts could change as additional cases close. The fact that 35 to 40% of the cases were still open at the time makes some of these impacts even more remarkable. And in fact, because the impacts in Kentucky were so large, we expect them to persist even as more cases close. It's also possible that significant employment impacts in Minnesota might become evident as more cases close. We were only able to look at short-term outcomes in this evaluation using the agency's case management, the data in their case management systems. SSA and RSA administrative data could reveal impacts on longer-term earnings, suspension of benefits, and SSA payments to VR agencies over time. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Todd Honeycutt, now.
Thanks, Purvi. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to be talking about the SGA project in terms of the implementation of the intervention, of the challenges that we observed with implementation, some of the lessons that we identified from the experiences of Kentucky and Minnesota, what's being sustained now that the demonstration's over, and considerations for other agencies, along with new directions. So first I want to look at the implementation of the intervention. And what we're talking about here is the ability and the processes that both Kentucky and Minnesota agencies undertook to put the SGA project innovation into play. Kentucky and Minnesota both had similar implementation experiences, at least as shown by their process measures. Each agency collected unique data related to the innovations that they were delivering. Not all applicants received innovation services, so that's apparent from these data, but not all were expected to. As Susan and Joe talked about, these were innovation targets or expectations to promote office-level capacity building, not fidelity. And really, it was used, the model was about testing these innovations, trying to figure out if and how they could be implemented. And there really wasn't a lot of information yet about whether or how to do this in a best or optimal way. And we have questions about consistent data entry in both programs. There are differences in offices that could have been driven by staffing issues, as well as issues in changes or information about how to input data and when to do so. So I'm going to walk you through two sets of slides. First on Kentucky. These are select measures about innovation implementation. And here we're looking at three different aspects of implementation: pacing, financial counseling, and teaming. And we find that in regards to pacing, about 40% of all enhanced service office applicants received an eligibility determination within 2 days of application. This is everybody who applied during the period, as Purvi talked about. We don't have information for the usual service offices. This is just enhanced services. Similarly, we have about 39% of individuals who had a signed IPE within 30 days. Of those with an IPE, this is a slightly different measure than what Purvi presented. Regarding financial counseling, in Kentucky, they were to provide a benefit summary and analysis within a certain period of time. It's a tool to understand benefits and employment, how employment will affect benefits. Almost half of individuals in the study received this analysis. And a little over half, 56% of individuals, had a record of an initial teaming meeting. With Minnesota, we have a similar set of measures, and it's oddly similar in terms of the storyline. About 40% of individuals had the pacing, positive pacing measures that we observe here: eligibility determination within 2 days of application, assigned IPE within 30 days of those with an IPE. They used a financial plan early on, simpler than a full benefits assessment. 48% of individuals received such a plan, and 53% of individuals received or had a record of an initial teaming meeting. Now, from one perspective, these data reflect success in implementing the innovations. A lot of applicants met the targets that were part of the innovations. But it also suggests that there was potential for increased adherence to the service model, or perhaps better data entry or better specifications to staff about the guidelines related to data entry related to these measures. But it also may reflect potential gaps. Clients for whom the innovations can or could not be applied. For example, those with receiving post-secondary services, those receiving supported employment, some of these measures might not be applicable. From a qualitative perspective, both states had similar implementation challenges. Staff described having large caseloads and logistical barriers as being an occasional impediment to pacing and service delivery. There was difficulty in the teaming approach being adopted because of communication and logistical barriers, particularly in rural areas. This idea that it's hard enough to get 2, 3, 4 people in the same room, but when you're having to deal with large geographic distances, that just presents an additional barrier to getting everybody in one place at one time. And as Joe alluded to, there was some confusion among staff about roles and responsibility. Who should do what and when? Who should enter the data for different activities? Each state had some implementation challenges that were unique to them. In Kentucky, some VR counselors initially resisted adopting the pacing standards and the faster approach to an IPE. In Minnesota, that wasn't necessarily a challenge because they were already moving along those types of innovations, thinking about faster pacing, thinking about the IP as a living document. In Kentucky, this was more novel. In Minnesota, that early involvement of the job placement specialist wasn't universally accepted by VR counselors for a couple of reasons. One, that some VR counselors liked that part of their jobs. They didn't want to cede that over to someone else. But the other part of it was that especially in rural areas, counselors felt that they were very knowledgeable about the employment environment in their area and didn't think that the job placement specialists had that same level of expertise. What lessons can we take away from Kentucky and Minnesota in terms of their implementation? One is that staff became more comfortable with a faster pace and seeing the plan for employment as an evolving document as implementation rolled out. Second, financial planning was viewed as highly beneficial by all staff who were involved in the demonstration, and they really saw the information from financial planning as helping to see a bigger financial and benefits picture and being able to make decisions around employment based on that picture. The job placement specialist role itself wasn't a big change, but that early involvement, being involved before the plan was developed, was perceived as leading to more realistic employment goal development. There was increasing value as the demonstration wore on of teaming, how to work together with other individuals, and collaborating with staff. Some folks saw that it improved staff morale to have this ability to reach out, talk with other people about a case, and brainstorm about different options. The demonstration also emphasized how important those linkages to Social Security Administration are, to being able to get benefits plan information at an early stage, quickly, to inform the plan for services. Now that it's over, what's being sustained? And Joe spoke a little bit about this. Staff in both states, both at the administrative level and at the line staff level, we're looking to incorporate aspects of the innovations, at least informally. The demonstration also reinforced thinking about the advantages of and the need for faster pacing in certain staffing situations. In Kentucky, they've begun to implement guidelines for and policies around best practices regarding faster pacing, quicker job placement involvement, and teaming approaches. These aren't required, but all staff are being exposed to these ideas. They've trained their staff on motivation for interview. They've implemented a new financial tool and training around that tool. So they're financial planning services, incorporating financial specialists into existing contracts, similar model, similar approach to what they've done under the SGA Project. And it's expanded statewide. And they've also standalone financial curriculum for staff to learn about benefits and financial issues. In terms of the implications for other VRA, one thing that's clear is that a faster pace of service without negative consequences.
Todd, you're breaking up a little bit. If you can try to speak into your mic a little better. If that's the issue, it might just be your connection.
Right, Gina, thank you. In terms of application for other agencies, a faster pace is possible without negative consequences. It may not be suitable for pacing for eligibility, determination for job placement referrals are all possible. Financial counseling and education components as well as the teaming strategies might be more difficult to implement because of the resource issues. Technical assistance to monitor and need to execute innovations in order to support the demonstration. And finally, an office-level random assignment approach is feasible, and it's a rigorous evaluation approach. So what's next, or what could be next, based on the demonstration? One is that there's a question about the value of teaming and the role of the counselor as part of that teaming. How can counselors navigate a teaming approach? How can they lead a team? How can they leverage that for servicing clients? Financial counseling is seen as important, but we don't know quite what the effects are regarding financial counseling. What is it that other agencies can and will apply from the demonstration findings and the demonstration model, and what will be the cost for them? There's a need, as Purvi said, a need for long-term evaluation findings on earnings of these individuals, of what happens to their federal disability benefits, at what happens for the agency in terms of their SSA cost reimbursements, whether any of those are affected. And finally, there's the idea that an office-level randomization can be applied to test other VR innovations. It's a good model for program evaluation approaches. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Before I turn it over to Steve Widdowson, I just want to remind people that we'll break for questions after Steve, and to please submit them through the Q&A panel on your screen at any time. So now I'm happy to turn it over to Steve Widdowson. We're fortunate to have him provide some remarks on the research. Thanks.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, everybody. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the webinar and take a few moments and give some they'll be my personal thoughts for the most part, but I think hopefully I'm representing our profession, the public VR profession at large. I want to frame my comments in a way that is responsive to the CSAVR Vision 2020 initiative. And some of you have heard about that. I'll not go into a great deal of detail except to say that the 4 objectives that you see in front of you right now is driven or are driven by a series of roundtables and discussions and surveys and input that we receive from a variety of stakeholders, consumers, businesses, state rehab councils, beltway organizations, a number, I have to include Congress and administration. And all of those types of feedback led us to develop this initiative we call Vision 2020, which essentially is to demonstrate that the public VR program is proactive, innovative, and responsive to the principles of WIOA as we prepare for the 100-year anniversary of the public VR program in 2020. I'd like to frame then my comments to each of these objectives in this way. Basically, I'd like to identify the first objective and then give a little bit of background as to why that's an objective, and then speak to how I view how this objective has responded to that particular objective, and then offer a few thoughts as far as opportunities and future consideration. I'll do that for each of the 4 categories. The first one, VR is mission-driven and dual customer-focused. Well, this objective was identified because really the public vocational rehabilitation program is looking to be more focused on careers, economic well-being, independence, and so it's not just about jobs. And so as you look at this particular initiative, this research, we can clearly see that when we look at Kentucky's wages and moving towards SGA and competitive integrated employment, it's obviously responsive to that particular objective. Same for Minnesota and their engagement of their consumers. So we see real evidence here that in this particular experience, we are responsive to that objective, that we're mission-driven and dual customer-focused. As far as opportunities in this particular, with this particular objective, really across the board for all 4 of these, I should probably mention that, implementation and sustainability, we brought that up, each presenter to some degree, and the ability to take this information and transfer that knowledge across the country is obviously a priority and a consideration to how we're going to actually make that happen. Research is clearly played out that this is benefiting competitive integrated employment outcomes. And frankly, that's a clear message we've heard from Congress and the administration. That is what's expected of the public vocational rehabilitation program. So as you look at this objective and the opportunities in this particular area of mission-driven, dual customer-focused, we really believe that, I believe that this pilot has demonstrated great potential. How we take that and engage other state agencies across the country will definitely be a challenge. You see that it's been resource intensive. We have 2 excellent mission-driven organizations represented here. And frankly, the reality is that we've got 78 other agencies that to really make a national impact, we hope and need to find ways to engage them as well. The second objective is VR leads change through innovative and edge practice. Why is this an objective? Because the feedback that we received indicated that we really needed to give evidence to the innovation that we are delivering throughout the country. There's no doubt, and the kudos should go to Kentucky and Minnesota for taking the risk and committing the resources that they needed to make this happen. What are some opportunities for us in this particular area? Well, quite frankly, we need to demonstrate post-WIOA that we are reaching out and doing things new and being more creative in the way that we go about business. We started this project in 2010. We'll take credit for it in post-WIOA, okay? So we appreciate that. The reality is that we've got to push forward and really lean into these kinds of practice to demonstrate our commitment to innovation. And the other part of this, once we've completed this research, how are we going to find ways to claim our success or to promote our success is probably the better way of saying it. So seeking opportunities to take this particular initiative and then show to the decision makers across the country and at the state and local levels that this truly does make a difference when it comes to competitive integrated employment outcomes and it comes to consumer engagement. The third area being VR customized services to meet the needs of the individual and business customer. Specifically, we experience this, or we look at this particular initiative because we felt like there's a need to ensure that we were clear on the dual customer focus, that we were engaging both the consumer and the employers. In this particular case, there's really evidence that we targeted a population within our individual consumer base, the DEI recipients, that falls into the underserved and traditionally difficult to serve and moving them into competitive integrated employment. That's an absolutely wonderful activity that we've been about, and it shows evidence that it works. When it comes to opportunities and future considerations, is this the type of activity that can be further expanded into those areas working with those specifically with mental health challenges for youth, and does it apply to youth on SSI? And the thing that I also wanted to mention that Joe mentioned earlier, and how does this play out in the mindset that we know that our consumers, individual customers, say that when they go to VR, what is one of the greatest benefits they get? And that is that relationship with their VR counselor. So the pacing of this project, how do we balance the need to have that full engagement and be able to ensure that consumers are getting the full value of the talents and skills of the VR program, of VR counselor. The last category, VR creates partnerships to maximize resources and opportunities. We developed this as an objective because we know that we were told that we really need to look for creating new passages, partnerships, and pathways, and to increase the resource pot that's available to the VR program. And this initiative obviously demonstrated that. It showed that in Minnesota, you were able to connect more with your JPS, your job placement specialist staff. In Kentucky, they realized that they need to work closer with their SSA folks, and that there was collaboration across the board, evidence that creating partnerships expands on our resource base. What are our challenges and potential considerations for the future? Well, what about engaging in some of our non-traditional partners? We talked about CRPs and CILs, I think, a little bit in this project, particularly Centers for Independent Living. Those are more of our traditional ones. What about the banking institution, financial institutions? What about other business partners as well? We know that the investment in any activity like this is high, and the resources are often limited. So how do we maximize our ability to build on our capacity? And then last, I just thought of this a few moments ago, it would be really interesting to see a project like this that was developed in a state that the VR agency had the Disability Determination Services Unit inside of the VR agency. Just a thought for consideration that may be an opportunity to maximize resources, limit the exchange of information, since in many of those environments, they're all within just a few feet of one another. That's my response. I appreciate the opportunity. And Gina, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Steve. All right, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A, and another Steve Bruns. You want to read the first question?
Sure. The first question is from Rebecca Spadoro, and she asks, what exactly constitutes financial counseling? Does it refer to doing a benefit summary and analysis or other service as well?
Joe, do you want to take that one?
Sure. First of all, we had a philosophy of what it should include, but it was different in different states. As we mentioned, as Purvi mentioned, I think Todd mentioned, we basically had our hypothesis. So the goal of this wasn't to do fidelity, but to give people some guidance. So our approach to financial counseling was to say we wanted you to include discussion of benefits, but we also wanted you to talk about money as a source of empowerment. So we basically instructed the financial specialist to use a model basically talking about where does money fit into your life and what goals do you have for your life that financial resources fit into. So we really encourage a financial specialist to develop that kind of approach. As I said, it played out differently in the two states. In Kentucky, all the people doing that were certified financial work incentives counselors. So there tended to be a focus on that much more than the broader issue, although they did focus on the broader issue. In Minnesota, there was both a broader set of skills that the people doing the financial counseling brought. A lot of them were trained as rehab counselors originally. But in addition, they tried to use elements of that curriculum that I mentioned, that Forced Cornerstones curriculum, which was developed by Lutheran Family Services under contract with the state, using partially our funds, but also some other state funds. That was basically a financial literacy program for people in impoverished circumstances. So we try to really incorporate both the knowledge about benefits, but also try to get people out of just thinking about what do I do just to keep my benefits, and more to talk about finances as a vehicle for empowerment.
All right, thanks, Joe. Steve, next question.
The next question is from Austin Nichols at Apt Associates, and he says, I'm curious to hear a comparison of the 6-month Kentucky experiment findings to the final evaluation findings. Can you show a hazard model of exiting into employment, or SGA? Are there spikes in exit rates at key points?
I can turn it over to Purvi, but the short answer is we didn't do that analysis. Purvi, do you have anything to add?
I was going to say that we did look at outcomes over the first 6 months, early outcomes, and the findings in this final set of evaluation findings are larger than they were in the early findings. But we haven't seen any spikes in exit rates at any particular time, but there really isn't a specific, 6-month milestone or 12-month milestone. So I wouldn't expect to see any spikes.
Steve, next question.
This next question is from Catherine Ibsen at the University of Montana. And she asks, how do you feel the financial counseling contributed to the outcomes in terms of competitive employment, attachment to VR, and achieving wages above the SGA level?
That's sort of a broad one that anyone can take.
Can I take a first pass?
Yeah, Todd, why don't you do it?
So one of the limitations of our evaluation is that we can't tell what's the relative impact of one aspect or one innovation to the others. So we're not in a good position to say that financial counseling was more important, say, than the pacing part or the job placement part. That's somewhat of a non-answer. We don't know from a quantitative perspective which of these innovations is better.
If I could, this is Joe, if I could just mention quickly, anecdotally, because we did, which we didn't present, but one of our staff has been doing some qualitative interviews. The anecdotal impressions of people were consistently that it was really helpful to help them make some choices that they couldn't even consider employment. That part was very clear anecdotally. I think statistically and even anecdotally, as Todd alluded to, whether they use that information to go above SGA, whether that was the major impact is unclear. But certainly anecdotally, there was a lot of, I guess in clinical terms, people reported that they got more hope out of the financial counseling early as something they could pursue in terms of employment.
And even the qualitative findings from the evaluation, the staff thought that that was a very important piece of all the 4 pieces. But Susan, sorry I interrupted you.
No. I think one of the lessons that we're learning out of the qualitative research study, which is following about 40 people that are participating in the intervention in both states, but is another level issue about information in general. And I think one of the things that we might want to think about as we look at financial counseling, job placement, and rehab counseling is how timely, accurate, and actionable is the information combined. So are people getting information that is accurate early in their VR tenure that they can act on and that makes sense to them? Financial counseling paired up with the job placement specialist may have changed how the whole team approached work and how that person trusted that that information was actionable.
All right, Steve, next one.
All right, this next question is from Cheryl Liss from the state of Michigan, and she asks, what was the basis of resistance for counselors adopting a faster approach to IPE? That is, do no harm, address barriers, ensure job goals consistent with the person's abilities and capabilities, and time management.
Who would like to take that?
Well, the simple answer is all the above.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking the same thing.
That was clearly impractical. I think the most often stated concern we first broached this in both states and in other states was that we were moving too quickly. We had the potential of moving too quickly, and we would then be scaring people who would feel stressed out. That's what people, off the cuff concern. But it was clear in practice. It was all those things, and you can also add concern about monitoring of the developmental IPE. For when RSA would come in and do monitoring, would it pass muster, this sort of developmental IPE, if we move quickly into a plan?
If I could add another element to that, Susan, I think the question is whether we were telling counselors to just pick up the pace and move faster, or whether we were also addressing other infrastructure issues of how long it takes to get medical records, or are you allowed to create a developmental IPE or not? What was the access to SSI, or rather SSDI information? So there were office level capacity issues that the counselors also said slowed down their ability to move quicker. So some of it, as a TA provider, you want to be careful not to say this is the fault of, or counselors just need to pick up the pace.
Yeah, I guess just one other quick thing for sort of inside baseball in terms of VR. People understood they could do eligibility more quickly, but in states that were into orders of selection, levels of severity, people felt that moving quickly into eligibility, the way we talked about presumptive eligibility, might not give them enough information in terms of making a studied judgment in terms of the correct category about order of selection.
All right, thanks. Steve, another one?
Yes, this next question is from Patricia Vasco from the Pennsylvania Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, and she asks, can you please explain DB 101?
Joe, do you want to do that, or Susan?
Yeah, I can do it quick. I mean, it's basically in fancy terms, a decision support web-based protocol developed out of the World Institute on Disability several years ago that's supposed to help guide people through providing knowledge about disability benefits, both federal and also there are state level manifestations that you can basically add to it that help. Originally, it was designed primarily for staff to use to help guide clients in terms of making judgments about the impact of employment on all these other financial things, Social Security, Section 8, food stamps. It's a lot much more user-friendly now than when it started. Minnesota has historically used it very well, and Kentucky has started to use it. One of the things that Minnesota in particular has decided is to use some of the sustainability resources to develop more user-friendly DB 101. So they really have an emphasis on either in partnership or with the client themselves, making it much more a first use tool as opposed to just something that staff use and then present the information to clients. There's also a website, you can like a DB101, I think it's .com, but it's out of the World Institute on Disability.
All right.
All right, this next question is from Jeffrey Himmeter, and he asks, given the project's direct relevance to SSA and that the motivation was related to SSA program growth, what level of involvement did SSA have? It's not clear whether it was consulted before, during, or after. Additionally, it does not appear SSA data were used. Why wasn't SSA more involved in these projects?
I'm happy to take that, Gina, as a start.
Okay.
Prior to the RSA releasing the priority, there was conversations that went on between RSA and SSA that we're not necessarily privy to, but there was some discussion going on. And one of RSA's motivations for this is that there was a lot of demonstration funds on looking at SSI, SSDI, and people's return to work, but there wasn't something that RSA had done in the past to look directly at VR's actions and what were under the control of VR. So when the RFP came out, that's what the project was formed as aspects of employment services that were under VR's control. With that said, I think we as grantees have worked in both states with the local offices of SSA and have discovered, there's a lot that needs to happen in terms of how rapidly eligibility happens, communication back and forth. Minnesota has a seamless relationship. Kentucky had a bit of a bumpy one. And I think we see that there's a lot of need to look at that kind of connection. Steve's idea about how to do this in a state that might have a DDS unit is interesting. The other is that Mathematica, as part of the work on the project, submitted to RSA a long-term evaluation plan to follow the cohort over time using SSA data to see what eventually happened. The outcome that we were supposed to look at was earnings at closure from VR. But I think from a public policy point of view, given the impact that we're seeing, it would be fantastic to see if we can explore that later on of what actually happened to them and their SSDI experience.
Yeah, and Susan, also remember in the very early days, there were two SSA staff people that were on our stakeholder panel when we were developing the intervention, so they had a little input early on, too, to those.
Yes, thanks.
All right, Steve, next question.
This next question is from Patricia Bianchi from the City College of New York, and she asks, how did you engage with employers? Were they part of the teaming? Were they part of the IPE?
Joe, do you want to take that?
Yeah, okay. The intervention was with the staff. Now in both Minnesota and Kentucky, and I was much more involved with Minnesota, and they had a more sort of long-term human resource development for their job placement specialists. The training they got independent of us, I mean, before we got involved, very much talked about how do they engage with employers, talked about dealing with stigma, dealing with discrimination, marketing. So our particular model didn't include them. They weren't officially part of the team, but certainly in Minnesota and to a little lesser extent in Kentucky, there was certainly an emphasis on to do marketing and to do job placement. You had to focus on the business customer too.
All right, this next question is from Dave Stapleton from Mathematica. and he asks, the goal of earnings above the SGA level may not be realistic or desirable for every SSDI-only beneficiary. What have you learned about the types of beneficiaries for which earnings above the SGA level are and are not a suitable objective? And what does that imply for delivering the SGA project's intervention to those for whom SGA earnings is not a suitable goal?
I'm going to throw that one over to Todd and Purvi.
So
Silence.
Todd, go ahead, Purvi.
Go ahead, Todd.
Okay, I was going to say that. So I think my initial reaction to that question was that I think the information about goals of SGA earning would probably come from the qualitative study that ICI has pursued. That we don't have information, from the evaluation that we conducted about who has a goal and who it's more an appropriate goal for regarding SGA level employment. Purvi?
Yeah, I will say, we are looking a little bit at whether some groups experienced a larger impact from the innovations than others. And it seems that the innovations helped improve outcomes for clients across different types of disabilities and across the age distribution. That doesn't say anything about who's able to earn at or above SGA or not, but it does seem that there is an impact on a diverse range of VR clients.
Yeah, this is Susan. I think I can give a little bit about the qualitative work that's being done in this area. One of the things that I'd like to push back on the question is a definition of realistic. And I think it's very hard to say who it will be desirable for or who it will be realistic for, because until you work with the person, you may be underestimating their potential. And what's coming out in the qualitative work is that a lot of things that give people an interest in pursuing employment have little to do with the things that we measure. And those things are, I want to be a good role model for my children. I don't want to sit at home and watch TV all day. I feel productive. I want to be a productive citizen. I want to contribute. And so there's these things that I think maybe speak to the rehab counseling aspect of the importance of motivational interviewing or other types of techniques in which you look at the strength of the individual and help them see things in a different way than they may have seen and address their needs. That being said, it's a small proportion of people that pursue work and pursue employment. One of the things we heard over and over again was people's ability to afford a car and gas was a big motivator. But not everybody may say that. Some folks think that they're just fine where they are at SSDI. So one of the discussions that would be great to look at is how do you, when you follow the lived experience of people, what they are saying about what makes them pursue work and high earnings, and then what kinds of things we're measuring to try to get at who will or will not, or who it is realistic for or not desirable for. Because I don't think we have a very good handle on how to predict that.
All right, thanks.
All right, this next question is from Janet Schaus from the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. And she asked, if a person moves off SSDI, are they able to retain Medicare coverage? And did the two states have adequate numbers of VR counselors?
Joe, do you want to answer?
Yeah, well, two separate. There are a lot of benefits, including the ability to retain Medicare, that come under sort of work incentives that Social Security already has in place that we would educate people about. I guess I'll just reinforce here that the premise of the project was that these kinds of things would help people make decisions to get above SGA and SSDI. People didn't go into the project and say, we want you to get off SSDI. The presumption is that these interventions would lead more naturally towards that. In terms of the second question, I think they both would say no, but I think it also relates to another question people had. The caseload size in Kentucky is much larger than the caseload size in Minnesota. So Minnesota's average caseload size is maybe 80 or 90. Kentucky, I'm not sure of. I think it was at some stage in the couple of hundreds. So a counselor would say 80 is way too many, but that tends to be kind of a VR average, 80 to 100. But it's still a lot of people.
So this last question you might have just addressed, Joe, but maybe we could provide a little clarification. Mary Borelli Bean asked us to define exactly what a large caseload was and what is the number per VRC.
Yeah, it's what I said. I mean, obviously, an individual counselor is going to think the caseload is large, but in terms of numbers, Minnesota in the VR world stratification has fairly low caseloads, 80 to 90, and Kentucky is on the higher end of that stratification. As I said, I think it was in the couple of hundreds. But what Todd was reporting about, which is accurate, is that counselors felt this was very labor intensive, whatever the size of those caseloads. Maybe with 10 people it wouldn't have been, but even with 80 people. But in VR terms, 80 is not considered a large caseload.
And just to follow up on that, when you talk with counselors, they're also, the SSDI only population was just a small part of their overall population, so they were doing a lot of other things, and so having to add this piece for a specific subset of their clients, just that could have felt somewhat burdensome, or just another thing for them to work on top of all the other things that they do with their clients.
All right, this next question is from Michael Stepansky, and he says, financial counseling beyond benefits counseling was mentioned. Could you elaborate on this? Was staff additional training necessary to deliver these services?
Again, I think this is a Joe question.
The question is if it's a Joe answer. Yes. Particularly in Minnesota, well, there was training in both states. Minnesota, because of the existing, as I mentioned, the local resources, there's this really linkage line that existed prior to us, and this 4 cornerstones training. The training that existed around financial counseling was fairly robust, and we basically implemented it within the project, but some of it was there. The additional training that the project helped fund was that every other week, teleconference with all the benefits counselors, with all the financial counselors run through the linkage line, and then the monthly in-person meeting. And that included both technical assistance staff from our project and local technical assistance staff. So there was a lot of training both for the project, but even predating the project for the financial specialists. Kentucky, they were all originally trained CWICs, but there was consultation with them through our technical assistance staff.
I'd also like to add, this is Susan, in Kentucky there was a longstanding interest in asset development, and they had taken on a lot of effort prior to our project and wanted to work in things like, how to open up a savings account and what about people who don't bank at all. The other was that we had on the TA team out of ICI, we had a person who was a CWIC, Rick Kugler. We also had a consultant, Mike Dalto, who provided a lot of technical assistance in the 2 states. One of our biggest issues in starting off the project was that there was very low capacity of CWICs available in Kentucky. I think we had put out an RFP to hire 3 in the different areas of Kentucky and got only 4 applicants and could only find very few people that were CWICs. So we had to do a lot of onboarding and a lot of work in that regard, and Kentucky also did that. As part of what they've learned, they are investing heavily in DB 101 and in other activities to get that increased capacity in-house.
Yeah, and as I said, if people are interested or not that familiar, they're both. DB101 has a website. That 4 Cornerstones training that I mentioned is actually accessible on the web through Lutheran Social Services in Minnesota. And there's also a very kind of interesting offshoot of that kind of financial education for low-income folks. It's one of my favorites in Delaware. It's called Stand By Me in Delaware, and also accessible on the web. So if you're interested, you might want to look at any of those.
All right, this next question is from Cheryl Liss from the state of Michigan. Were the clients at closure the same clients that entered the system during the project?
Harvey, you want to talk about that?
Sure. We followed the same clients, basically the clients that applied for services during roughly mid-2015 to mid-2016. We followed them over the course of the evaluation. Some of them have closed by the time we began looking at the data in the end of April. So the share of clients that were closed was about 60 to 65%, and all the outcomes that we present are for the full set of clients that applied during that period. So they're not, when I say that 8.2% of clients in Kentucky closed with earnings at or above SGA, that's 8.2% of all of the clients that applied over that period. It's not 8.2 of those that had closed.
All right, this next question is from Michael Stepanski. Could you describe the type of work done with SSA to accelerate eligibility determination?
So Susan?
This is Susan. Yeah. I think that applied mostly to Kentucky, but I'll turn it over to Joe for Minnesota. Eligibility determination was what Kentucky VR did. And so the connection was to try to enable Kentucky OVR to get as quickly as possible for those folks that applied, whether they were on DI already or not. And that communication channel was a bit of a hardship in that they had to kind of jerry-rig communication, relied on SSA office staff to basically hand check, looked at the ticket, did every kind of way that they could do that. They also, in Kentucky, changed the process of presumptive eligibility internally. So Kentucky had a kind of patching up of ways that they could communicate rapidly with Social Security that relied on individuals. What they're building now is a much sleeker, better mechanism for having that process. So it's not eligibility determination for DI, it was eligibility determination for VR.
Joe, do you want to say
Minnesota
anything?
We basically didn't have to do much. The process was very tight and very speedy in Minnesota, and in fact, the person at Social Security wanted to be very involved and wanted to know how she could help. So that was pretty much well in place before we got there. We just reinforced it.
All right, and this next question is from Bill Gropp from Colorado DVR. What is the return rate of the clients that participate in this project? By that, do most clients stay at the same job after leaving the DVR program or come back?
Harvey, do you want to address that?
Okay.
Oh, or Susan. Either
Sure.
one, somebody?
That is a really good question, and will require looking at these clients over time, over a longer period of time.
I think that is a fantastic question. We would love to follow them, definitely. I think one of the pieces of information that might be useful, regardless of what happens with this project, is that both VR agencies are going to have to report on Q4 earnings after exit as part of the new performance measures. So there may be ways to look at, as VR is tracking them in their performance outcomes, what's happened to them that Kentucky and Minnesota can report on.
All right, well, I'm told that's the last question we have. So we'll end a few minutes early, which is a rare and never happened before event. But I want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And please let us know what you think of the forum by completing the electronic survey that you can access either through the webinar or through a link that will be emailed to you. And we do take your feedback seriously and use it to improve our forums in the future. So thank you to our speakers, and thanks to the audience, and enjoy the rest of your day.